Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Baseball versus the World, a podcast about how baseball relates to the world and how the rest of the world relates to baseball. I'm your host and guide on this maiden voyage through the vast cosmos of all things baseball, Javier Reyes, staff writer here at justbaseball.com, as well as the host of the Locked On Padres podcast, where you might be familiar with some of my work on not just the Padres, but for a bunch of other stuff, writing about Ryan Mountcastle and Castles and baseball video games and just fun things. Great website. Recommend everyone go check out justbaseball.com. This is the fourth episode of the show for April 16th, 2024. And let me tell you, check me out on Twitter, first of all, at Javipeno, Javiipeno. Be sure to follow the show account at Baseball versus the World on Twitter, and the same goes for the YouTube. And today, we've got yet another special guest, because many have often said, I will only have the most illustrious of guests on this show. And today is no different. New York Times best-selling and award-winning author, known for such works as Paradise Falls, Fly Girls, and Outside Shot, as well as contributing to places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Politico, as well as his new book, which we'll be discussing today, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. It is one Sir Keith O'Brien. Keith, how are you hanging today?
I'm great, man. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm super glad to have you. And for those who are wondering, why are you talking about Pete Rose? You know, last week you did funny predictions, and then the week before you talked about baseball origins in New York, and then you did favorite broadcaster calls. So what are you thinking, Javier? Why did they give you a show? Some might ask. You know, I mean, I'm still asking that question myself, but the reason is because Pete Rose has something a little bit in common with a certain superstar in today's game, Shohei Ohtani. And that's right. We're going to be talking about betting and scandals, and most importantly, Keith's new book, which details all of it. Keith, first of all, thank you so much for coming on this show. I think that, you sent me an advanced copy of the book, and I really have enjoyed it from what I've read so far. And look, it's a classic rise and fall story, but it is really relevant right now. But before we get into like the Shohei Ohtani stuff of this and kind of today's current game and landscape, first I just want to ask you some kind of softball questions, I guess, in a lot of ways. What made you in the first place want to write this book?
Well, I think that most people, even baseball fans, have forgotten why we ever cared about Pete Rose in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
In the last 35 years since he's been banned from baseball and has made mistake after mistake off the field, Pete Rose has sort of become this caricature of his former self. And I do think that we, even baseball fans, have forgotten, why he was ever important in the first place. So I wanted to go back and tell that whole story because it is an epic rise and it is an epic fall. And when you go back and you look at the story of Pete Rose like that, you realize pretty quickly that you simply cannot write the history of baseball in the latter part of the 20th century without Pete Rose. He is square in the middle of some of the biggest moments on the field and many of the biggest controversies off the field. And so that was the first thing. And the second is, listen, when I started my research 2.5 years ago, no one could have predicted that the book would be coming out during a time where baseball is facing its biggest gambling scandals since 1989. Nobody, would have predicted that. But what was clear, when I started this work in 2021, was that the world had changed. It had changed a lot since 1989 when Pete was banned, but it changed mostly, a lot since 2018 with the sweeping legalization of gambling in America. And it seemed like a great time to revisit the story of one of our most notorious gamblers. And I do think that is, what Pete is.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that with Pete Rose, it's for someone like me, I'm not like, I wasn't, sentient. I wasn't alive back when Pete Rose was really a thing, but, he was called the Hit King for a very long time. But for me and my generation, you kind of only know him for two things. And that's, his brief appearance on Fox Sports when he was joking around with A-Rod, which was like, dare I say, the best press he'd had in like forever, just personally, and the cheating scandal. And then you kind of forget like that he was a ball player and that he was known for like being Hustle, as the name of the book, Charlie Hustle. Like, I think it's just such an old school player. And for me reading through the book, you really cover that, right? Like, this isn't just hey, Yeah, he was really good at baseball. No, you like start from the very beginning, which I thought was fascinating too.
I mean, yeah, if you're a baseball fan and you don't know the story of Pete Rose, or you don't know why, he's relevant, then yeah, I think you're absolutely going to love this book, because he's there on the field in some of the most iconic moments of the 20th century. Whether it was, the collision at home plate in the 1970 All-Star game, multiple epic World Series and playoff series in the 1970s. Of course, the Big Red Machine team, 75, 76, arguably one of the best baseball teams ever assembled. There's his hit streak in
Yeah.
1978, where he hits in 44 consecutive games, which nobody, by the way, has done since 1978. And then there is the all-time hit record in 1985. And listen, I'm too young to remember the Big Red Machine years, but I'm in the wheelhouse for my love of baseball, my boyhood love of baseball, in 1985, when Pete, passes Ty Cobb, with a single to left center field. And if you were alive and you were watching that night, that you remember exactly where you were. I know I remember exactly where I was. I was in my parents' house in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we were standing in front of the television because you couldn't sit, in that moment. And that night, the standing ovation at Riverfront Stadium lasts for 7 minutes. And all the networks cut away from regularly scheduled programming to carry the at bat live. It was sort of a singular moment, not just in baseball history, but in American history. People had not thought that this record would ever fall, and it does.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And some people, especially people of my age, might argue, oh, well, Ichiro is the true hit king. You know what I mean? And that's kind of a debate, and one that, frankly, I think is unsolvable. You just can't. You know what I mean? Like, you just, for all the reasons you discuss in this book, right? This is just one of those debates that just you can't necessarily have in terms of who's the true hit king. But I'm wondering also with the book, just as a quick aside, what were some writers, some other stories you think that you took inspiration from, or even just any pieces of work that inspired you to want to write this story, or even just your style of writing in the first place?
So I love the former reporter, longtime author, and late great writer David Halberstam. Halberstam was a journalist, and then moved into books. And Halberstam wrote a lot about baseball. My favorite Halberstam baseball book is October 1964, which is ostensibly a narrative about the 1964 World Series
Mhm.
between a young, diverse St. Louis Cardinals team versus sort of the old guard New York Yankees. But what Halberstam did so well in his writing was it was never just about baseball. It was about life. It was about America. It was about culture. It was about us. And
Mhm.
so that's definitely someone whose work I admired as a young writer, still admire now, and someone that I've you know I maybe perhaps tried to emulate.
Absolutely. And shouts to Bob Gibson on that team. Shouts to him somewhat becoming relevant recently, as he had like a stretch. I forgot what season of his career, his stretch that's like the greatest 25 consecutive start stretch, lowest ERA, like of all time, next to like Jake Arrieta and Blake Snell this past year. I say that because I'm a Padres fan and I wanted to plug Blake Snell. But in all seriousness, with the book as well, I'm wondering, there was a lot that went into this, obviously. I'm not kidding, guys. It goes from early days of Pete Rose's career, and then of course you get the gambling stuff later. But it's just I really like and I think many others love, a rise and fall story, just plain and simple. And there's a lot of research into that. What do you think was your favorite part to research, or even just write for the entire book? Do you think?
Wow. I mean, so many great scenes in this book. For me, it's hard to choose my favorite. Um, writing the baseball scenes was a lot of fun. And because the moments are sometimes some of the most exciting baseball moments of the latter half of the 20th century.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, if I had to choose one of those, I would choose the All Star Game,
Mm.
1970. Uh,
I've seen this, like I've watched on YouTube, I should say, this game. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so this game, is iconic because of how it's going to end. Pete Rose is going to barrel into the catcher from the Cleveland Indians, a young Ray Fosse, in the bottom of the 12th to win the game.
Hmm.
Uh, but the build up to that is crucial. You
Hmm.
know, in a sort of twist of fate, Fosse and Rose, their wives, and another player and his wife end up having dinner together the night before. They spend the whole night together. Pete Rose doesn't know Ray Fosse until that dinner, and then the next night, this game, even if it hadn't have ended the way it does, was also significant.
Hmm.
Um, it features 24 future Hall of Famers.
Yeah.
It draws a television audience of 50 million viewers, 50 million watching an All-Star game. Uh, President Richard Nixon is there. He stays for the whole game, not in a box. He's in a seat behind the home dugout. And then in the bottom of the 12th, there's this collision at home as Pete tries to score the winning run. And so, I rebuilt this game, these scenes, with reporting of the players who were there, and with the television footage, raw television footage, and also the newspaper coverage. And what's great about writing about baseball, say in the 1970s, is that it was covered in a way that we don't have as much today. Every team had multiple beat writers. At a game like this, the All-Star game, they
Hmm.
all sent at least one national beat writer. So
Hmm.
if you want to reconstruct what happened in the Ray Fosse Pete Rose collision, I could draw on newspaper accounts that were written by 15, 20, 30 different reporters who all had different quotes, different details, different moments. So rebuilding that was, I would say, fun,
Hmm.
because this is a significant baseball moment. And I would argue this is the moment when Pete Rose becomes Pete Rose. I mean,
Hmm.
today, we can all watch every game.
Yeah.
We doesn't matter where we live. We can watch our favorite team play, or we
Hmm.
can listen to them. Even get the home call on our on Sirius, XM
Yeah.
radio, right? Like
Yeah.
in the 60s, it wasn't like that, of course. And going into that All-Star game, most baseball fans had never seen Pete Rose play. He was just a name in the box score. He was, yeah, a two-time batting champion and a rookie of the year, but people hadn't seen him play. And that night, they will. This is the moment that I think Pete Rose becomes Pete Rose.
I think so too, because I think even for me, outside the cheating and outside the funny A-Rod sketches on TV and whatnot, I think that if there was a singular baseball play, this is probably the one. It's the one that they always show in the highlights. And I think that's a great point about the All-Star game. And by the way, like real NBA dream team vibes, by the way. I like this. Look, Keith's not joking. I know you wouldn't joke, of course. But genuinely like incredible stuff with the players on this team. Gaylord Perry, Johnny Bench, Tom Seaver, Hank Aaron, Roberto Clemente, Willie Mays, Brooks Robinson, Frank Robinson, Tommy Hart. Like there's so many players. Carl Yastrzemski. Genuinely so many players on this team. And I think it's just funny to like look back at that, especially with, I think we're in an era where like all-star games have had a weirdness. I think baseball's the only one that like still has that vibe of importance to it. Although, like you said, couldn't watch all these guys. So there might have been people who saw Pete Rose for the first time and said, "Oh my gosh, I love this guy. He's like all hustle, he's all energy, he's all spark." And there's like a relatability to that versus like the godlike, I think, vibe of a lot of other players. Do you think that that's the same sort of perspective people have on Rose?
Well, I do. And I think that's crucial to why we ever cared about him. Pete Rose's story really has a lot of echoes to the American story, that bedtime story that we like to tell ourselves, that if you work hard, if you try hard, if you hustle, you can overcome anything, you can be anyone. That is the American story. That was Pete Rose's story. And there's a realness to that. He's from this white working class neighborhood of Cincinnati. He's never the best player on his youth baseball teams. He's never the best player on his high school baseball team. I think, it's only through local connections and a good bit of luck that he ever gets an opportunity to play in the minors. Frankly, today he probably wouldn't get that chance. Pete Rose is initially sent to a rung of baseball that is so low that it doesn't even exist anymore. But to Pete Rose's credit, when he gets opportunities in his career, he typically makes the most of them, and he does. And so, he climbs that ladder. He, and with some more lucky breaks, gets to the mountaintop, and then by his own, sort of decisions, choices, addictions, he's going to lose all that. He's going to fall off that mountaintop. So, but even before we knew about the fall, people love that story of the rise. And, I think we all love that story. It's the classic story. And many times in the early part of his career, people see in Pete something they like about their own selves. And as a result of that, sort of help push him along.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any like other favorite rise and fall stories? Because I really think that is like the preeminent like favorite story to tell, whether people choose to admit it or not. You know what I mean? I think that everyone kind of likes it. Do you think that there's other rise and fall stories for you, like as impactful as this one? Do you think?
In sports or
Not to put you on the spot. I feel like I just did. Yeah,
or like in any part of.
I'd say sports. Lord knows we could do plenty outside of sports.
In some of my book events recently, other names have come up that sort of, if not the rise and fall, certainly have some echoes to the Pete Rose story. One, in that they self-implode, based on their own choices, right?
Yeah.
And one of those players or athletes would be Lance Armstrong, the cyclist, multi-time Tour de France winner, cancer survivor who becomes an American hero because he comes back from metastatic cancer and then wins multiple Tour de France's. And turns out, he was taking performance-enhancing drugs to make it happen. So that story has a similar sort of vibe to it. But to me, it's a little bit less sympathetic in that, Pete's going to go down, for his own choices too. But it wasn't because of choices he was making to, make him a more prodigious athlete or a better hitter. He's going to go down for off-field problems that are also related to addiction. And so I think while there's a lot of similarities in those two rise and falls, in some ways, I think Pete Rose might be a bit more sympathetic of a tragic hero.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's hard for people, I think, today to see that because he's made some questionable comments every now and then. I know he voiced his, opinion on the Shohei Ohtani situation, which don't worry, folks, we're getting into soon. All that stuff. But yeah, like the Lance Armstrong, like I had to like get rid of my like Live Strong shirt. Like, cause this is a guy who like went after people, you know what I mean? And then he's just like, oh yeah, okay, fine, I did it. Like, he's the worst. And honestly, it's feels like he's being lost from public like zeitgeist a little bit. That's how much people like turned on him, which is good because people deserve to turn on. But also, I think people are forgetting or might forget down the line about Lance Armstrong, and that's, I guess, for other people to debate whether or not maybe we just should. I don't know. Some people might argue we should forget it. You grew up in Cincinnati, though. Just to pivot now to the cheating part of this, you grew up in Cincinnati. Can you paint some of the picture of just what was that like? Because like having this hero, and especially with all the things we just talked about, being grit and grind. You know what I mean? Not like the beautiful talent of other players that you're like, wow, these are like Greek gods, sort of players. And then here's Pete Rose tackling people at home plate, hustling out for singles and all that stuff. He wasn't even like the best stolen base guy, wasn't a power guy, just bat to ball, the end. What was it kind of like, do you think, at that time? Can you paint a picture of when it started coming out, this story about him being a cheater?
Well, so Cincinnati has a bit of an inferiority complex, like many small, big cities. I would say like many small, big Midwestern cities. It's not Chicago. It's not New York. It's this small Midwestern city. It is historically conservative, sort of a buttoned up place, where the main employer is Procter and Gamble, that makes Ivory soap. So it's a conservative place. It has this inferiority complex, and it Pete Rose is its native son. And Cincinnati likes, season Pete, those things that it also likes about itself. That if we work hard, we can be better, we can be bigger. And so, when the scandal hits, it was devastating for baseball.
Yeah.
I think that's important to remember. Again, we see Pete as this caricature of himself now, this man sort of shouting at the clouds, in the hinterlands of his own sport. But this was bad for baseball in 1989 when this scandal emerges. And it was particularly bad for Cincinnati. Cincinnatians, refused, frankly, to believe that it could be true. Even when the evidence grew to the point that most objective people would have to look at this story and say, yeah, Pete seems to have bet on baseball. He seems to have bet on the Reds. Many Cincinnatians refused to do it. They believe Pete Rose, who continues to say for 15 more years that he hasn't done this thing. And so, the scandal hurts baseball. It hurts Cincinnati. I think it hurts the Cincinnati Reds. And in some ways, I would say the city still hasn't fully recovered from the scandal.
Yeah, I mean, it must have just been a lot. I'm trying to think of like what the current day equivalent would be outside of Ohtani. You know what I mean? Because that, I think there's a bunch of different reasons it's different for those two. I just said like Greek god, like that is Shohei Ohtani, right? Like there's nothing about him that feels like, yeah, that's ours. He's also an international player, so it would literally just be wrong to say that for a number of other reasons. But like with Pete Rose, for all the reasons we've discussed, for that to come out, and then you have the whole issue with, oh well, he only bet on the Reds to win. And that's where I think there's been some, in my opinion, a little bit of semantics where it's like, bottom line is you did this thing, you broke this cardinal rule. I think Ed's, like you said, it's kind of been hanging over him for forever. Honestly, like I don't think that it's ever going to go away. He's not going to get into the Baseball Hall of Fame. It's an unfortunate thing, I think, in a lot of ways, because this guy was really beloved, I think.
He was. And I think what's important to remember about the Hall of Fame is that also changed. Pete is banned in 1989.
Yes.
He is first identified and called in for possibly rumors of his gambling in February of that year. Major League Baseball launches a massive investigation. They hire an outside independent counsel to lead it. It's not a major league official, and it takes 6 months for this case to play out before he's banned. And Pete agrees to his banishment. I think this is also important.
Mm-hmm.
He signs the document that Bart Giamatti, the commissioner of baseball, also signs, saying that he is permanently ineligible. But when he signs that document in August 1989, Pete does so fully believing that in 2 years his name will appear on the ballot at Cooperstown. He was set to appear for the first time in 1991, which would have been 5 years after his last at bat as a player. But in early 1991, 10 months before his name would have appeared on the ballot, the National Baseball Hall of Fame changes the rules. And they now state that in order for a player to appear on the ballot, that player must be in good standing. That player must be an eligible player.
Mm-hmm. Character clause, yeah.
And so Pete is no longer eligible. He's essentially removed from the ballot. And I think that's so interesting because of a couple reasons. One, the baseball writers are uniformly furious about the rule change. They wanted the opportunity to vote yes or no. Many people write columns saying, I wasn't going to vote for him, but I wanted the opportunity to vote against him, essentially. But they never get that chance. And future Hall of Famer and Pete Rose's friend and former manager, Sparky Anderson, says something at that time that I think is true. Sparky said that this new rule was a mistake, that because he wouldn't appear on the ballot, we wouldn't be able to sort it out, to essentially to talk about it. And because of that, Sparky predicted that this whole Pete Rose thing was going to loom over baseball forever. And I do think he was right about that.
Yeah, it certainly has. And speaking of looming over baseball forever, I think, and you wrote this, by the way, also as well. Let me just quickly pull that up. You wrote a column for The Atlantic recently titled "The Shohei Ohtani Scandal Won't Be the Last." And you mentioned that investigators who pursued Pete Rose back in the day have predicted that baseball and every other sport is not nearly as safe as it wants us to believe, right? Why do you think, though, specifically to focus on baseball, why do you think more than any other sport, at least American, I've heard some things about soccer, but American sports, why do you think baseball is the one that seems to be so synonymous with gambling, cheating sort of scandals versus the other two, which I'm not saying there haven't been with football and basketball, but it just seems like baseball, like you said, looms a shadow over it. Everyone these days, I mean, how long were people talking about? I remember Chris Davis of the Orioles had that year where he hit like 52 home runs. Most people, are like, oh, is he juicing? You know what I mean? Why do you think it's baseball in particular?
So that's a great question because, baseball's been, forget about gambling for a second. Baseball's been wringing its hands about the steroid guys for years and still is. Meanwhile, in football, a player gets caught for using performance enhancing drugs. They get like a 4-game suspension. They're right back. And some of those guys are in the Hall of Fame. So it is a different thing. It's different with gambling. It's different with steroids. And I think it goes back to baseball's roots. We have always wanted to see baseball as this pure American pastime. There is a purity that we like to prescribe onto baseball. And, having, lived inside this particular story for a few years now and gone back and done, research about all kinds of scandals in baseball during Pete's era and before it, I can tell you baseball was never pure. It was in fact really unpolished sport.
Yeah.
And at the time when Pete comes up, it's raw. It's filled with colorful characters who do and say things you could never get away with today. but we like to think of baseball as being pure. And I think for those reasons, the steroid guys have paid a greater price, and the gambling rules in baseball are far more strict. There have been football players, as you and many of your viewers and listeners know, who've been caught gambling on their own games in the past few
Yes.
years, and
Yes.
they've been suspended, right?
Mm-hmm.
Suspended for a handful of games, or suspended for the year, and then they're back. Meanwhile, P Rose is still banished, and if a player were to be caught today gambling on the games, he would face the same punishment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when it comes to another thing for baseball that didn't help is some of its best players. I think that's another problem where it's like you haven't necessarily seen your LeBron Jameses get caught with anything, right? Not necessarily. You literally haven't. And I think that, yeah, like baseball, like, this past year in football, like there was a wide receiver. He was a rookie that was suspended for a little bit for betting on some stuff. There was another wide receiver did, but not the same stature where baseball, it's like Alex Rodriguez, Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, who were in the documentary recently, actually, Long Gone Summer, a documentary for what it's worth that I did not like because they only spent like 10 minutes talking about the scandal. It's like, how are you going to talk about these two? That's like doing a documentary on Nixon for 2 hours and then only the last 10 minutes is about Watergate. Like, I just thought that was ridiculous. But, I think with baseball as well, there's been and I disagree so strongly with people who are like, no, it wouldn't help you in basketball. Of course it would. But I think that in baseball, you see some of its biggest players, the fact that home runs were such a part of the game and they kind of, keep it under the rug. We could get into the Bud Selig thing. Or then you have players like Brady Anderson, who's like, I have a friend who wanted to start a podcast and call it the Brady Anderson year because it's famous for him just hitting like 50 home runs out of nowhere. And everyone's like, okay, something must have happened here. But you have that. You have the Black Sox scandal. You have integration, right? You have all the segregation. You have the Jackie Robinson stuff. What does that mean? All the Negro League players that were kept out of baseball. How's that, going to affect things and how we view the sport? And then you have plenty of others, I imagine. And I think that that's the big thing with baseball is there's just been so many, and it's never just been like some bench player. You know what I mean? Not to disparage bench players. We love y'all. But I feel like that's one of the differences.
You're right. That's a great point. And the numbers are different too.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody can, very few people could rattle off right now what is the record for most career passing yards in the NFL. Nobody knows the number.
Yeah.
Nobody knows the number, of points that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar scored, before LeBron passed it. Nobody knows the number.
Yeah.
People know the numbers in baseball.
Yeah.
56 game hitting streak. 60, 61 home run.
Yeah.
715 for Hank Aaron, right? The numbers matter. And this isn't part of my book, but now we're talking about it. And so as a baseball fan, for me, the steroid era sort of gutted the numbers. It made the numbers feel meaningless. Like you said, when someone like Brady Anderson is suddenly hitting 50 out of nowhere, it does feel meaningless. And that hurt baseball a lot. It hurt it for me, I'll say,
for sure.
I'm in my 20s and 30s when the steroid years are playing out. And, it started to feel like sort of just like a sham. So I think the numbers are another thing that matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember, like, for me growing up, A-Rod getting to 500 was an event. Meanwhile, now I'm like, I remember Albert Pujols passed 600 or 700 not too long ago. It was cool. It was a story. It was definitely made the news, but it wasn't, every TV network, will he get it today the way that A-Rod was? And that's what's crazy is that it must have been even crazier before then with the Bonds and the Hank Aarons and the Sammy Sosa, Mark McGwires. And I think that's a big part of it. And I think that that's why baseball is in a tough spot. But with to not go too much on steroids, because that's a whole nother topic for
It's
this
a
this
different
podcast. Yeah,
book.
it's a different book. Maybe that's the next one, right? When it comes to now, Shohei Ohtani, that's the latest one. And like you said, for you to have been starting this book 2.5 years ago, for it to come out now, a very prescient, I think, story in a lot of ways, obviously. What do you think? Just straightforward, just what do you think some of the parallels are between the Shohei Ohtani and his translator Ippei, that situation going on right now that we're learning new information about as we record this very podcast, versus the Pete Rose gambling scandal as well?
Yeah. So, this is, in some ways, a fast moving story. It's also, I would say, still a murky story. I get maybe just dispatch with what we know off the top. Shohei has denied any involvement with the gambling. The federal investigation suggests that he didn't know about the
Mm-hmm.
gambling. That Ippei Mizuhara was allegedly doing it on his own, allegedly to the tune of $16 million,
Yeah.
which, by the way, is 4 times greater of a number than was originally suggested just a few weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
$16 million, allegedly. So that's what we know right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that way, it is a little different, right? The original allegations involving Pete Rose was that he had bet on baseball and that
Mm-hmm.
he had bet on the Reds, and he had done this with bookies. But there are some parallels that I think are important to know. The Pete Rose story pops up onto the radar in 1989, not for something that happened 6 weeks earlier or 6 months earlier or even 3 years earlier. It's been a freight train a coming for years. And federal investigators in Cincinnati have identified, men in Pete's inner circle as problematic. So one by one, the FBI in Cincinnati starts to pick up guys who were either on the fringes of Pete's inner circle or squarely in the middle of it, and these guys begin to turn on each other. Sports Illustrated catches wind of it. And begins to write about it in the way that ESPN and the Los Angeles Times began to write about this story a few weeks ago. And it's the media coverage that forces Major League Baseball to take action. So all of those things, are very similar to me, very clear historic parallels. And, the last thing I'll say is this. The Pete Rose investigation took the entire spring to finish. And then they're in court the entire summer arguing about it. And I think in that way, we are just still at the very beginning on this particular scandal involving Ippei Mizuhara, Shohei's interpreter. We now have some federal investigative documents, but it's just the start. And remember, there's still an investigation into the alleged illegal bookmaker in Southern California. And, that man is going to know a lot about how this went down. And, in 1989, one reason why we learned so much about what was happening with Pete Rose is that one of his bookies, who is also under a federal investigation, faces charges in federal court and decides to plead guilty and to tell everything. And were that to happen here, we're going to know a heck of a lot more about the gambling that allegedly happened right inside the Dodger locker room.
Yeah, just a lot of crazy stuff, and it makes me wonder. Like, I'm wondering if that were to happen, like, will we find about some other characters we don't even know about? Like, how many people can be implicated in this? And that's, I think, one thing that you have attested to, and not just this show, but also your writing elsewhere, and not just what has been attested to, but with the Ohtani situation. And it's very weird. Like, we're talking like there's evidence of him, like a Mizuhara responding, saying, technically, I did steal from him. It's all over from me. That's a real quote from these exchanges. And that's just, like you said, like the entire spring is what it took for Pete Rose. And I think that with this situation, it's just a lot. It's a lot, right? And there's obviously differences, but we've seen such an increase. That's what I was about to ask you next. In gambling stuff, and we alluded to it before. The football players, you had the basketball player Jonte Porter, who has been getting in trouble, and that was like a role player, right? And I've seen some other takes on this. I saw Shaquille O'Neal the other day talk about how he met up with a bookie accidentally once, or not. I got to be careful with my language here, but he had talked to someone who was like, yeah, we don't go after the players necessarily. We go after the refs because the players make too much money. I think that makes sense, but also who knows? You know what I mean? If you have a problem, you have a problem. I think, and that's what a lot of this. I mean, look at Ipe. Sure, he's not a player, but you're working side by side and basically almost are de facto his agent for like the biggest player in the sport, possibly one of the biggest athletes currently in the world right now. And you have this thing still going on. So I think that like everything is open for learning. And I do think that Shohei, after the recent reports, has looked better. I don't think he's been made to look worse after the recent things that have come out, but it's a lot, man. It's a lot. And I'm wondering, like, do you think that this is just like the beginning? Like, do you think that with this increase of, sponsorships from gambling places and all this stuff, the league's getting in bed with them, the NBA saying we're going to start experimenting with putting odds at the bottom of the league pass games, how much more do you think that this is going to be, in the news being talked about?
So I think two different and oppositional things can both be true here. The first is, all the leagues will tell you that there are layers of protection in place that will prevent corruption from happening, and that's true. Every league contracts with security providers that are watching wagering activity in real time, and can immediately flag curious wagers and trace it all the way to an IP address, someone's phone, someone's computer. And I'm talking about like in a matter of minutes, potentially can know where this is happening. And that is, a level of protection that didn't exist, say, in 1989, when Pete was placing his bets. Those bets had been going on at least for 3 years, according to my reporting. And it still takes 10, 12 weeks for the Major League Baseball investigation to unravel that case.
Mm-hmm.
Today you could flag something in real time on someone's phone. But the thing is, it's not just happening on legal apps on the phones. And that's what the Ipe Mizuhara story shows clearly. Every player knows, and every employee of a team knows, you can't place bets on your phone. You can't place bets on the games on your phone on legal apps. They will find that. But there are still illegal bookies in the shadows. And it's not just an insignificant number. According to the most recent calculations of the American Gaming Association, Americans place about $60 billion a year with bets with illegal bookies. $60 billion with illegal bookies. And these guys, aren't the men they used to be. They're not just in the shadows in backy smoke rooms, back smoky rooms.
Yeah.
They often have their own websites and apps where people can do it easily. They're just not being tracked or monitored by authorities. So I do think we're going to see more of it. I do think gambling and the sweeping legalization of it is changing how we consume sports, how we talk about sports. I think it's fundamentally changing, frankly, American culture. And I think just as important, it's making gambling more acceptable. And when something is more acceptable, more people are going to try it, more people are going to do it. And that is not just the fans. It I think inevitably will include more players.
Wow. It gets really dark. And I'm wondering, for an even darker question, dare I say, in certain respects, Ohtani's like the most beloved player basically in the sport. I mean, heck, I could literally just tweet the words Shohei Ohtani and I get all this like engagement and whatnot. I remember doing that like a couple years ago. It was like, where'd you people come from? This is amazing. This was written by Michael Bauman recently over at Fangraphs. In order for competitive sports to work as an entertainment enterprise, it has to not only be irreproachably legitimate, but look irreproachably legitimate. And if the Mizuhara affair proved anything, it's that a sizable percentage of baseball fans are willing to call the probability of the sport into question, even with little evidence, right? So even if you have all this stuff that's saying Ohtani didn't know, there are still so many people who view it this way. Do you think that Shohei Ohtani's image is going to permanently be tarnished by this?
So
as of right now, obviously we don't
yeah,
know anymore,
what
but
we
yeah.
know right now suggests that maybe he wasn't involved and that maybe he didn't know at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think there are going to be many fans who believe that and will support him. But I think there are many fans who are going to reject that, and will always be wondering. So at least in the short term, it is undoubtedly put a couple of dings in this golden uh, enamel that he had around his career. And what'll be interesting to see is if there are more dings and blemishes going forward. Um, Again, I think while we know more today than we knew just a couple days ago about this affair in Los Angeles, I think we're still just at the very surface,
Mm.
and I think we're going to know a lot more over the course of the coming months.
And as I was mentioned before, maybe it won't be Ohtani. Maybe it'll be someone else. You know what I mean? Like there's just so many areas for this to go down. I think in a lot of ways. And like, hey, I've enjoyed like some of the jokes, frankly, because it's also not my team. I'm a Padres fan, so it's easier for me to stomach and whatnot. Like I remember Grant Brisbee over at the Athletic tweeted, "No, I said Mookie Betts," which that just made me laugh in a lot of ways. But yeah, so there's a lot of jokes for it. Hey, I don't know if it'll stay, but if it does, tough beat for baseball. You've had the not first, but like 2010s, your big all-star superstar was on a bad team, never made the playoffs, and wasn't as easy to market in Mike Trout. And then if you have your next big one and Shohei Ohtani have this gambling scandal, just tough beat for the sport. What can I say?
And regardless of how this affects Shohei, this is still bad for baseball.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, Ippei Mizuhara wasn't just Shohei Ohtani's friend and interpreter. He was an employee of
Yeah.
Major League Baseball with intimate access to the locker rooms. And again, there's still no evidence at this time that he was placing bets on baseball. But the notion that someone with that kind of access could be interacting with illegal bookmakers to the tune of millions and millions of dollars is a shocking story in its own right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well said. But everybody, if you want to learn more about Pete Rose, of course, go check out Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose. It is fantastic. I've been enjoying it. And seriously, if you just like baseball history and you just want to be reminded again, and it's not that the book will ignore the Pete Rose stuff, but it's fun to see and be like, wow, yeah, like this was a great player and it was fun and he's unique. And there's a reason why people still defend him, as you talked about with the Cincinnati folk and in general, even people who probably aren't from Cincinnati still love him. But Keith, to close out the show, as always, we're in the awards segment of the show, everybody. This week, we've got 2 awards. The first of which is the Uncut Gems Award for the most ill-advised bet you've ever seen. I'm going to go first on this one. And I am not a big gambling person. The only gambles that I've made actually don't involve money that have ended up being ones that I've regretted, where I had to like tweet something dumb afterwards for some reason. Like that was my greatest fear. But for me, Davis and Marrow are going to win this one for me. They are a comedic duo. They no longer are working together, but they were. They did a show together on Showtime, and they wrote a book called God Level Knowledge Starts. And one of the things that the latter of the two, Mero, talked about was it was either him or his friend. I don't have it right in front of me. Had like some 18 game player parlay. I think I'm using the terminology correctly. Um, and it was to win like 30K, something crazy. But that's what happens. Like you have a parlay of like 18 things that has to go right. And he wrote about how, and just to tie it back around to my Padres fandom, he was one thing away from it going through. And all that had to happen was my team, the San Diego Padres, when this bet was made, they had to hold on to, I believe, a 5-run lead in the 9th inning, just 3 more outs, and they blew it. And then he was like, I never betting ever again. Agreed. Could you imagine how frustrating it would be as if it was like, you're about to win 50K. The last thing you need is LeBron James to score 1 point. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of the equivalent. It would drive me insane. And it is just, for me, a warning to be like, I'm good. I'm good, Keith. You know what I mean? I'm good on that. I like doing bets that don't involve money. I love competition, but I just could not even imagine the stomach. So that's my winner, my nominee for the Uncut Gem Awards for most ill-advised, tragic bet occurrence that I've ever seen.
All right, I love that. Yeah, against parlays in all ways, but certainly an 18-way parlay. That seems like a bad idea. I'm going to go with maybe a less insane choice here, but it's one related to my reporting for my book. It's about P. Rose's gambling.
Mm-hmm.
There are not very many written records that exist as to what he did or didn't wager on. There's a handful of notes that a whistleblower provides in 1989 that are actually his bets from the 87 season.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are some notes in a notebook that a friend of his kept who was placing his bets from 1986. In the notes from 1986, Pete loved to bet on March Madness on the college basketball tournament. And that month in March 1986, Pete Rose just takes a bath. He for all the kids out there, smart gamblers identify 1 or 2 games, and that's what they bet on. They find the leverage points, they find the bargains, they go with that. Pete Rose in March of 1986 was betting on 8, 10, 12 games a day. And anyone will tell you that is not how to win. And he does not. Again, based on my reporting, the notebook, and my interviews with Mike Bertolini, Pete's friend who kept that notebook, Pete is losing as much as $30,000 a week in March 1986 betting on college basketball.
Man. And like, even without context, you could have just left it at bet on college basketball, frankly. And I cannot think of a more foolish one because, and I love college basketball. I got love for it. March Madness just finished. Shouts to UConn. Shouts to South Carolina for the women's. It was super, super fun. But like the idea of like, hey, I've had one bracket go my way once and it was amazing. Totally loved it. Fantastic. It was like a 50-person group my senior year of college. It's the only time I ever like won a major thing. And the stress of betting on like 20-year-olds to not have a bad game, because this isn't a series, it's 1 game elimination, so anything can happen. Hey, I picked Virginia the year that they lost to UMBC. That's right. And then I won by picking Virginia again because I'm a glutton for punishment. I might be a masochist in some ways, but yeah, honestly, you could have left it at that. But Pete Rose and his gambling on March Madness, what do you say, 30,000 a day or week?
Well, he was at least once he bet $30,000 in a single day, and at least 1 week he lost $30,000 for the week. Again, but 8, 10, 12 games a day, that's a really, really poor way to approach gambling.
Yeah, pretty poor way. Some would say a little bit of an addiction thing there going on. The next award, though, so those are the 2 nominees. Listeners and viewers, let us know which ones you like the best. The next award the last award, I should say. The Travis Kelce Award. You might be wondering if you're watching on YouTube why I'm calling it this. It's the Travis Kelce Award for a player that got more famous, much more famous for non-sports reasons, in this case, baseball. Keith, if you don't mind, I'll go first on this one because he's been relevant this week. That's why I'm going to bring it up. It is Jose Canseco. Jose Canseco is one of the weirder characters that baseball has ever produced. Whistleblower in his own right. But this guy has been made more famous by his beef with others, particularly his beef with former baseball players, and just bringing this up all the time. He's gotten into beef with Shaquille O'Neal on Twitter before. This is a real thing. And just this week, he was getting into beef with PFT commentator over at Barstool Sports about how he would kick his butt. Canseco, and I'm not trying to you made it to the major leagues, but basically has like a 1-2 year stretch where he's very, very good. And then he's known for, I believe he's the one where the ball hit off of his head and landed into a home run. I think that was him. Not really known necessarily for a player. Nowadays, everyone's like, yeah, that's the crazy lunatic guy on Twitter that just goes off all the time on everything, right? That's Jose Canseco. He is my nominee. My other nominee would also be a relevant one, but for a more fun reason, it's Nick Castellanos. Anyone who follows baseball land and knows the memes about a ball to deep left, that'll make it a 4-0 ball game. Literally every time something bad happens, people make this joke about how Castellanos is going to hit a home run. So that's my other nominee. Keith, do you have any for this illustrious Travis Kelce Award?
Yes, I'm sad that we are lumping these two men in with the name Travis Kelce, but yes, I do. I have a nominee.
Might need a name change, yeah.
I will stay in the beef category because this player should have been known as being one of the most clutch postseason pitchers of all time. He should have been celebrated for saving his team in the postseason on the biggest stage more than once and winning World Series titles when it seemed as if there was no chance of doing that. Instead, this player who had a borderline and I think probably legitimate Hall of Fame candidacy argument has submarined his own chances again and again with his outspoken opinions and his business dealings. This player maybe should start a podcast with Jose Canseco. That would be fascinating. And I am referring, of course, to Curt Schilling, formerly of the Boston Red Sox, Arizona Diamondbacks, and Philadelphia Phillies.
For everyone listening or watching, the millions at home, no, I did not bribe Keith to bring up some Boston slander. I love to make fun of all Boston teams. Curt Schilling, simply put, probably the most openly bigoted person we've had in the three major sports in a long time. I honestly think we could leave it at that. And then also the financial stuff with the video game that I played in. It was actually very good, by the way. But with all that stuff and the state of Rhode Island, everything he does, quite frankly, just a big piece of shit. That's who Curt Schilling is. And like you, very importantly, like really clutch. I mean, the bloody sock thing, 2004, like the greatest upset arguably in sports history. There's comeback in sports history. Unfortunately, Boston people got that to go their way, but yeah. And I'm with you. I feel very bad that I named this the Travis Kelce Award now, who's just a stand-up good football player who dated a pop star. I feel so bad now.
I mean, we should have maybe stayed in that category of just like dating stars, and then we could have gone with like Joe DiMaggio or Noah Garcia-Parra. We could have done something different, but yeah, we went dark.
We got dark fast. So shout out to Curt Schilling, Jose Canseco, the little bit of a mention to Nick Castellanos. That's what I should have went with. I should have went with Castellanos. That's more of a fun one in a lot of ways. But Keith, this has been so much fun. Everybody, like I said, go check out his book. It just launched and it's very relevant to the current culture we are in. Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball, as well as many of his other works, Paradise Falls, Fly Girls, and Outside Shot. You can read his writing online. You'll find it. You all know how the internet works. This has been the 4th episode of Baseball versus the World, a podcast about how baseball relates to the rest of the world and how the rest of the world relates to baseball. Keith, it's been so much fun having you on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. I had a blast.